Hi everyone, welcome to part 2. Okay, my opponent has just played a4. So now, after securing the f5 square, I planted my knight there, which, is a good post for the knight. It's probably the best one that black can hope for at the moment. Adds additional pressure to d4, and if this knight moves, then d4 is going to drop, exploiting this pin, as I already said. So my opponent continued with queen c1 in order to play rook b5 next, and double rooks to bear down on my king. And seeing this coming, as well as the potential for increased pressure on b7 with this pawn and maybe the queen as well, I played rook d7 so I can follow up with queen d8 after rook b5, which I figured was a better square than c7 because I can reroute and maybe go to the king side later. So rook b5, now queen d8, and around this point I have to say I was not happy with my position and was regretting my choice of opening. My opponent was getting lots of activity here on the queen side, whilst I did not have any counterplay to speak of. I was having to play defensive moves which nobody likes, and it was unclear how to create anything to work with in the meantime on the king side or in the center or anywhere. But what can you do when you find yourself in such positions? I knew I wasn't getting mated, and once I was happy that I had a solid defensive position, which is definitely the case now, I was free to try and make something on the king side. My opponents doubled rooks with rook a b1, and this is problematic because it threatens things like a later rook c5 and rook takes c6. Even if the king goes to a8 to break this pin that the rook is creating here, sacking the exchange, with the queen coming in and maybe the bishop as well, could create very strong play. So I was presented with the fact that I would have to keep an eye on the c6 knight, as well as keeping b7 under lock and key. And I figured I could do this with a later rook c7 and queen e8. So this keeps b7 and c6 defended twice each, and if he's got 3 attackers, then I have nothing more to worry about. The king is covering b7 and he'll have to sack the exchange and exchange one more piece, which should be okay for black. And I was therefore still satisfied that my opponent had no attack, and it's going to take a long time, but there's still no danger of bishop c1 a3 and then d6 check, because the knight here on f5 has that square covered. So it's very important to maintain this knight for that reason. Although it's a long way off, it's still good to keep an eye on that kind of thing. So happy that I could defend my king, though still sorely regretting the decision to castle long against the open b file, and now played f6, putting some pressure on the black center and allowing for ideas such as queen e8 to g6 combined with h4, h3. If he plays g3, then sacking the knight and getting strong play. And as well as this, f6 also enables a later g5, which of course I have to play in order to try and get any kind of pawn storm going on his king. And interestingly, neither side wants to capture and relieve this pressure here. If white does so, then after g takes f6, the g file is opened, which is going to be strong for black. And also, after e takes f6, this d6 square is weakened, so this knight, for example, could reroute via d6 with tempo on his rook if it doesn't move, and then bounce into e4, and it's looking good. But also, if black captures, firstly, the pressure is gone from the black position, but secondly, after, for example, f takes e5, d takes e5, this bishop is freed up for activity. It can reroute to f2, for example, and bear down on a black king, and in conjunction with a5, a6, there's going to be sacrificial attacks and all kinds of stuff to worry about there. So black also doesn't want to capture, and if he does, he won't ever be able to play the g5 push, which is another very good reason not to capture there, because it's going to be hard to create initiative if there's no g5 push. So my opponent continued with queen a3, which is a good diagonal for the queen, and there's ideas like a5 and then queen a4 and then rook c5, applying increased pressure to the knight here on c6. Certainly rook takes c6, and if b takes c6, queen takes c6, and well, I have to move my king before rook takes c6 is checked, and you know what I mean, there'll be all kinds of issues and tactical problems to deal with there, and it's going to apply maximum pressure to my position. But with my setup of rook c7 and queen e8, which you know he can't do anything to stop, then there's nothing to fear. So with this in mind, as well as playing queen g6 and pushing h4 h3, I played queen e8 now, which is where I want my queen to be. And you know, at this point I was already considering sacking a pawn with something like g5 immediately. So if white plays f takes g5, black answers with f takes e5 and opens up the center this way. Best play continues, knight takes e5, knight takes e5, and black can try and create play on the king side. Or for example, if he doesn't go for that line, if he plays instead e takes f6, then black can play g4, and he's managed to create a pawn storm. But now knight e5, and what does black have here? This is very uncomfortable. Playing knight takes e5 just cements the extra pawn and gives white this massive center. So the only other move is rook c7 because the knight's attacked, but this becomes very tricky after rook c5. So seeing even just a knight e5, I saw I had to have more patience. And also in that first line, after g5, f takes g5, f takes e5, knight takes e5, knight takes e5. Doesn't have to play d takes e5. He can play bishop f4, pinning this knight and gaining a powerful square for his dark squared bishop in the process. So in this, you know, bishop takes e5 with check, winning the rook on h8 is threatened now. So you know, for example, rook g8, and now bishop takes e5, king a8, and white is definitely much better here. But you know, the main reason I rejected it was because of the first line, which is just going to cement the other pawn here as well. Another possibility is knight takes e5, d takes e5, and now d4. With my rook and queen lined up like this, I can hope for some kind of play on the d file and in the center while his heavy pieces are committed to the queen side. But really this is impatient and crazy. The opening of the board will again favor white with the bishops, and you know, bishop takes c4 is immediately possible if this d4 push is played. So although interesting, it's definitely not sound to sacrifice a pawn or anything else just yet, and black has to content himself with slower play. So to get back to the game, I played queen e8, as I said, both attacking and defensive move. And my opponent answered with queen c1, which is, you know, a direct retreat from his last move. It's perhaps having seen this queen g6 idea and worried about it, and this move queen c1 involves a loss of tempo because of course the queen has just moved from a3 to c1, but the position is not such that this is a critical factor. Fritz preferred instead a5, which, you know, keeps the pressure going. Now if I try queen g6, he can play a6, which is strong. You know, I should play h4 here. If instead b6, tempting looking move, white is looking good after rook takes b6 check. Forcing a takes b6, now rook takes b6, king a8, which is an important detail. If I play king a7, I can't bring my rook over here, which I need to do in order to defend. And also if king a7, queen c5 is virtually winning. So king a8, and now rook takes c6, and rook a7 is definitely the best defensive move. Rook takes e6 was one of the threats, but even so, white is much better here. Although it's not easy to bring more pieces to attacking positions, the rook and queen can move to the b file, and that is enough for a serious advantage. In any case, white has 2 pawns for the exchange and can definitely look forward to the better game. So instead of playing b6, I would play h4, and play might continue. A takes b7, rook takes b7, and now queen c5, attacking the knight. So the only move is king c7, and again white has very uncomfortable pressure, but objectively everything is okay. For example, rook takes b7, bishop takes b7, and now bishop c1, a powerful rerouting of the bishop, and black doesn't have time now for h3, g3 and sacking on g3, because this allows queen d6 check if the knight moves from g3, and serious problems for black, who would be regretting very much his weakened dark squares, and bishop a3 is pending. Needless to say, these lines looked a lot more promising for white than the game continuation, and I'm glad my opponent didn't elect for them. That said, it's not so easy to sack the exchange as in the first line when you don't have an engine showing you the path to victory, and if white is not willing to do so, then he has an impossible time in getting to the black king. Okay, so back to the game continuation. My opponent has just played queen c1, and I continued with h4 with the idea that queen g6 will now effectively come with tempo, because h3 is threatened next. And I saw now there's also the possibility of knight g3, and if h takes g3, h takes g3, it was a dangerous thorn pawn in conjunction with the open h file and the crude threat of queen h5 and mating the white king. Thus slowly black is starting to create some threats from behind the wall of the barricade. Again here the g5 pawn sacrifice still doesn't work for the same reasons as before. And on h4 it's important to note the pawn is more of a target than on h5, but black always has the option of playing h3, and white would have to be brave to take it at any moment, even if it's not an exchange, because it's going to open lines to the white king. My opponent answered with bishop e1, which I thought was a good defensive move, as it renders the ideas of any sacks on g3 unsound and also adds further pressure to the h4 pawn. And this means that my queen is now misplaced on e8, and I still had to figure out a way to break the king side open, or perhaps the center, and I came to the conclusion that queen d8 was the best move for several reasons. Firstly, it supports f6 so that g5 can be played, and I also had the idea of playing queen c7 at some point, again with the prospect of playing g5, where e takes f6 can be met with g takes f4, which is going to be supported by the queen on c7 here. And if after g5 f takes g5 is played, then f takes e5 is an answer, and it's supported by the queen and the knight here on e5. And this leads to an opening that I thought would favor black, and as well as that, there's again the possibility of playing f takes e5 right off the bat, opening the f file, and if white answers with f takes e5, and also allowing this d4 push if white answers with d takes e5, and because all the black pieces are aimed for d4, so if he takes, then I can take with my knight. It's going to be attacking his bishop, his knight and his rook, so there's going to be play of some kind there. Of course he doesn't have to do it, but it's an attractive option and a good reason to consider it. But again, playing this d4 push at any moment is going to allow bishop takes c4, so it would be a pawn sack, and one that would probably favour white, all things considered. Okay, that's end of part 2.